Hey folks, and welcome to LevelUp 2021. I'm your co-host, Mishka Katkoff, and today we're going to talk about mobile games market trends. So who am I? I'm a CEO and a co-founder of Savage Game Studios. I'm founder of Deconstructor of Fun, blog, podcast, advisory service, and an entrepreneur in residence for Play Ventures, a gaming-focused premier VC fund. This presentation comes from my own perspective, and that is a perspective of somebody who's managing a studio, who's looking at the budget, thinking about what should we be making, how long it takes, how difficult it is to make, and what is the market like. So when a studio is making a new game, you're really thinking about three things. One is, of course, what do the people want to make? What do you have passion for? What do you want to deliver? What kind of game you want to make? Anyways, the number two is, what can you actually build with the resources you have or with some additional resources you can acquire during your journey. Now, in my experience, these are vastly far away from each other quite often, but when they coincide, you can actually make something very interesting. But then there's the third thing, and this is what this presentation is going to focus on, and that is, what does the market want? What do the players likely will play? And will the game that you want to make, that you can make, will that be actually a successful game on the market? So this is the sweet spot, and this is what usually happens. And trust me, you don't want to be here. I've been here many times. Not a fun place. There's a lot of data in this presentation, and the data is based on taxonomy that I would develop with Game Refinery and Sensor Tower, and the numbers are there to show trends. The net revenues as well as the downloads are from Sensor Tower, but I'm sure App Annie has very similar numbers if you go and look. But most important is to take all the numbers with a grain of salt. They're there to show trend lines rather than the exact numbers of revenue or downloads. So let's get into it. As an industry, we've been for a while here in a very much mature and stable phase. But 2020 looked something like this for the games industry, especially the mobile games. You see, when looking at downloads and spend and consumer spend, well, the story is pretty fantastic. On the global game download side, 33% increase. On the global consumer spend, we see a 26% increase in spend. And then there's a misconceptions. One of the misconceptions is often that the amount of games on the market is constantly increasing. And that's actually not true. The amount of games in the market has been pretty much stable for the last 3 years. And the amount of games coming into the market has also been very stable for the last 3 years, even though we've had hyper-casual games growing massively during this time. There are also some other misconceptions, and that is regarded towards the top of the game market. You see, usually people see that the top 100 games make most of the revenues, and that is true. They do make a little bit over half of the revenues, especially in the US. But when we look at the market as a whole, companies with a sustainable business, and by sustainable I mean over 10 millions in net revenues, those have been increasing steadily. And even if you start lowering that amount to maybe 8, maybe 5 million, then that number has vastly grown throughout the last 3 years. So the other misconception is about the top is that it's always stable, and that's definitely not the truth, and hasn't been the truth during the 2020. So games that launched in January of 2017, the Clash of Clans, the Candy Crushes, and so forth, only 1/4 of them is still in the top 100. And that number was actually 55 in 2019. And then the story of how hard it is to get to the top, that is definitely true. But the time on average for games to reach the top has actually decreased in 2020 from 9 months in 2019 to 8 months in 2020. And most importantly, there's a misconception that it is impossible to break into the top 100. In 2019, 28 games were able to do that. In 2020, 42 games entered top 100. So that leads us to a story of how the mobile games industry looks like. A lot of misconception is that it looks something like this, a peak and everybody else is in the valley. But in my opinion, it's more like this. There's definitely those who have and those who have not, but the amount of have is constantly increasing and the top is quite wide instead of being quite narrow. And always the question is like, what does it take to be a top dog? What do the top publishers look like? And in my opinion, there's four categories that you have to hit in order to become the top dog. Number one is having the marketing power. And what I mean by marketing power is having the ability to ship and grow a game. Number two is product excellence. And product excellence means that you can actually sustain your position at the top. That means having excellent live operation services, being able to deliver great updates one after another and at a very high pace to cater to this ever demanding audience on mobile. The third element is having a diversified portfolio. We've seen big games launch that change the landscape quite significantly as they grab audience from other games. And we've seen also significant battles happening on the marketing sides in certain genres where if you are catering to that audience, it might be too expensive for you to acquire new players. So it is important to diversify your portfolio. And by diversification, I don't mean making just different games. I mean making games for different audiences. So in case something happens to a certain audience for extended period of time, you still have a de-risked through a diversified portfolio. And fourth element is something that actually contradicts the diversification to some extent. It means genre mastery. It means making something and continue making something throughout the time and becoming better at it. So the best of the publishers tend to have multiple different studios, and those studios focus on different genres and become ever better in those genres, allowing them to have a diversified portfolio. And that genre mastery, of course, creates mastery in marketing as well as product excellence of certain game types. Now let's talk about the mobile games market. The way I see it, it's a division into four different categories: casual games, mid-core games, casino, and sports. Now when we look at the casual games in 2020, it's about a category of 10 billion in revenue plus a 4 billion in additional ad revenues. Overall, the casual games grew by 36% in 2020 and marked pretty much 40% of all in-app purchases on mobile. What's most important in casual games is that 3 out of 4 installs on mobile is accounted for a casual game. The mid-core is pretty much the same size in terms of in-app purchases. The ad revenue is smaller, and we actually haven't calculated it here. The year-over-year revenues in 2020 grew by a quarter, and this category makes 40% of all in-app purchase revenues. The main difference is the amount of installs. Only 13% of all the installs go to mid-core. That just shows how well monetizing these games are. The casino, that was the biggest winner during the lockdowns. You close the normal casinos, well, people flood into these mobile versions of casinos. And the revenue for casino genre grew by astonishing 50% during the 2020. This genre makes pretty much 20% of all in-app purchase revenues and accounts only for 2% of the downloads. Final category, sports, the smallest out of them all, only a little bit over 1 billion in net revenues. Year-over-year growth, still a very respective 30%, and about 10% of all the downloads. But let's look at 5 key trends in all these categories and genres. Number one is puzzle games actually becoming the top grossing genre on mobile. And what we can see in the puzzle genre is that the year-over-year growth was about 30%. We saw merge games grow and peak to some extent. We saw these games also focusing shifting their focus from level-based progressions and focusing purely on ad to actually mashing different genres together and focusing significantly on elder game. A good example is Project Makeover from AppLovin's Magic Tavern. On the hyper-casual side, well, I've been definitely writing about hyper-casuals and have been thinking like, how can they sustain, how can they keep on growing? In 2020, they still kept on growing, reaching 12 billion installs, growing up from 8 in 2019. And in my calculation, that accounts for about 3 billion in-app ads. The trend in hyper-casual was moving from very difficult skill-based game to adding more of these feel-good mechanics. We also saw some of these misleading ads becoming actual games. So the misleading ads, they actually became good games. And what we're seeing on the hyper-casual front is a lot of the publishers are focusing their shift to achieve hybrid monetization, to have more in-app purchases, to have better retention, to have more progression elements, and to offset future changes in the industry. And those future changes are, of course, the major risk, and that is the IDFA and the IDFA effect on the CPM. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. On the mid-core side, of course, strategy games, 5 billion in revenue, growth of about 20%. You got RPGs, growth of about 30%, reaching 3.3 billion. The biggest risk in this category is definitely launching and scaling, especially after post-IDFA. It's now hard with all these games being so good at monetization, having such a loyal fan base, but the visibility that is going to disappear with the IDFA is going to have a significant risk on these two genres. So I see the effect being in three folds. Number one is the monetization will go broad, and we've seen this in games like AFK Arena, which are very, very broad in their monetization and very much retention focused. We will see more collaboration with different IPs. We already see games in the West doing extremely well with having strong IP backgrounds like the Star Wars and the Marvels, but we've also seen different campaigns being done with IPs like AFK Arena's campaign with Assassin's Creed that was just a short while ago. But perhaps the biggest trend that we'll be seeing is happening on the cross-platform side. So we've seen a lot of games introduce their PC clients. Raid, Shadow Legends is a great example of this. And we've seen just straight up cross-platform games like Genshin Impact being launched on multiple platforms at the same time. Fourth trend is regarding the casino. So casino, of course, the biggest winners of the lockdowns with the 50% growth, reaching about 5 billion in revenue. This genre is extremely competitive, and that bundled with the upcoming IDFA changes really pushes the publishers to continue to diversify at a rapid pace. During last year, we saw Coin Master. I mean, Coin Master was highly successful for 2019 and 2018, but in 2020 they experienced a 100% growth of revenue, and we saw a lot of clones come in for that game. But I think the biggest trend is not towards those Coin Master type of clones, games that bundle together this. How would I say, almost like a casual PvP elements with the slot machines or other casino elements. I think the biggest disruptor can come in through legalization of online and mobile casinos. We've seen this happening now in the US as state by state has been legalizing them. If this happens, I think the casino companies can be a major disruptor. They've already proven that they're really good at launching and growing games, and they're really good at M&A. So with the added revenue coming in from legalized gambling, the casino genre can be one of the leading disruptors in the industry. And finally, it's the shooters. So shooters are perhaps the most popular genre in games, in the sense that the same shooter games are played in the West, in the East, in the North, in the South. People just like shooters without much cultural difference. But what we've seen is that the growth of the Battle Royale has been slowing down. It started in 2019, and in 2020 it kind of peaked. What shooter are known for is that core male audience, heavy on core male audience, typically low CPIs, and also low ARPDAUs because of the highly competitive nature and inability to sell any kind of power progression. Now, the top shooters have been introducing new progression vectors. PUBG's Metro Royale is a good example of that. Progression vectors that allow players to actually increase their power a little bit as they're playing the game, even though it is a PvP game. So there can be an argument made that there is an opportunity for new entrants to focus on purely progression mechanics from the start and actually launch those type of games and have good unit economics, as they can acquire players at the price of a PvP game, but then monetize them as more of a typical, mid-core game. Now, that is an opportunity, and the whole idea here is always to look at the red oceans and what are the blue spots in the red ocean. And the way I like to look at it is, I would look at a category like casual games. I would break it down into genres, and then I would break it down into subgenres. And then I would look at specific subgenres, like for example, merge in this case, a growth of 104% over 2020. Then I would start analyzing what is a merge game. Well, first of all, you merge in merge games. Then you do a lot of harvesting in most of these games. There's a lot of discovery in the area, and it's driven by quests. And there's a lot of designing that the players do. And what's interesting is that all the top merge games look pretty much the same. They're almost made for the same audience. Then there's a bunch of clones of these top games that also look quite the same. And then there's some variety to these existing games that mash up different game types together. But what's clear from that is all of the games are pretty much made for the same audience. There are differences in individual games, but the audience is quite the same. And as we start looking at the downloads, we see more and more games coming in, and we see these games scaling up, but then we see revenue going down at the same time. So this would lead to say that the genre has peaked and then there's no point in entering it. But what if you make a same game for a different audience? What I mean by that is, let's consider games like Top War, a very much male-driven game. In that game, there's PvP, but there's also a different kind of merging mechanics. And there's base building, and those three together actually generate a game with significant amount of installs and even more significant amount of revenue. Now, of course, this is a case of, yes, you can add a merge mechanic to an existing strategy game, but and that strategy game is a very male focused, but could you do it somewhere else, have the merge mechanic and still reach high downloads with a more male-driven audience? And yes, you can actually do that. There's a good example of Merge Planes with over 80 million, 85 million installs. That's an idle game with a more 50-50 audience, both male and female, that can do pretty well. So the question becomes, how do you market to that different audience? How can you find that different audience for your merge game that is similar than existing ones, but just for a more male-driven audience? And that's probably where the biggest trend and the biggest unknown in the industry is in 2019. And of course, we're talking about the AT&T, not AT&T, but ATT. And we're talking about IDFA deprecation. Now, what's going to happen when IDFA deprecates? In my opinion, this is the sequence that we're going to see. So studios will start flying half blind, meaning that we don't actually know what kind of audience we're acquiring and how well they perform. So that makes us become more conservative and reduce spend in advertising. Now, as we reduce spend in advertising, the CPMs will start dropping. And as the CPMs drop, naturally ad monetization will decrease. And that will lead to more games with broader appeal to benefit from that, or appeal that is very clearly segmented towards certain type of audience. Games like, let's say, Fishing Clash or a Hunting Clash. Nobody who doesn't like fishing will be installing that game, so I think they are pretty safe for that. On the other hand, games with high ad monetization and whale-driven monetization will suffer because they need both. They need the high CPMs, or they need a lot of information of their audience they're acquiring. And I think even though these games will skew towards more of the Google Android system, I think it's just a matter of time before Google will also deprecate their ad identifier. Now, it will lead to other things as well. One is the resurgence of IP licensing deals. So during 2020, well, let's take a step back. Of course, the reason for using an IP is that it improves your top of the funnel, your funnel metrics, both from App Store optimization as well as your IPM. And the reason why this will be useful is not only because of the increase of IPM, but also because entertainment companies haven't been doing really great during the lockdowns. And during the lockdowns, we also saw a lot of streaming services being launched and a lot of effort putting in, a lot of marquee shows coming in for those streaming services. They also need different visibility, and games is probably one of the best ways to engage with that audience. The second thing that's going to happen is the role of product marketing is going to increase. Now, product marketing is somebody is a function that sits between the growth team and the product development team. So the focus for product marketing is going more towards understanding your player base, understanding their traits, and through that they will give the better understanding of what is the total addressable market that you're going after. And what they'll be doing day to day is really improving marketability, because that is something that we still can improve on pretty much daily basis by running with different services, seeing how our ads perform on the top of the funnel. And I think that's where the biggest wins can be gotten. And as our games become more focused on broad appeal with IPs, there's of course something that's going to happen, and that is broadening of the media mix. So what I mean by broadening of the media mix is TV, billboards, podcasts, radios, of course influencers. All of these will be new channels, and all of these will present a certain type of challenge, and that is, how do you measure audience that is coming from these different media channels? And in my opinion, the incrementality measurement will become more and more important, and it is something that is quite difficult to achieve for individual studios, and service providers that can do that will actually have their hands full. But most importantly, the winners in 2021 and going forward are the content fortresses. And what makes a content fortress, or this walled garden, as some people say, is first of all, you have to have a good operational ad tech. What I mean by that is you have to essentially create your own ad network that caters your own broad portfolio of games. And as you have this broad portfolio of games and the capability to serve the audience with ads inside that portfolio, then the question is about how to manage that portfolio. And doing that effectively and very number-based is crucial for a well-functioning content fortress. And final element is the command economy. And what this means is essentially executives and leadership that can focus on growing the ecosystem as a whole, instead of focusing on divisional battles or bureaucracy, not bureaucracy, but more of a political battles inside the company. So pure focus on numbers, on growth of the ecosystem, not looking at specific genres, not looking at that, but just looking at the growth as a whole. And in my opinion, these three elements will lead to a powerful content fortress and a publisher that can reap the benefits in 2021. So that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, email there. I promise to answer sometime. So, but thank you for listening and